Welcome back to another episode of the Brawn Body Health and Fitness Podcast. Joining me today is Eric Hsu. Eric and I are going to be discussing acceleration, deceleration, linear and curvilinear patterns, and so much more. So we discuss a lot as it relates to sprinting, running, and that sort of thing. Great little episode here for you today. As always, all of our episodes in Season 5 are sponsored by Isophit, my go-to for all things isometric strength training. For more on Isophit, you can check the description below. Enjoy. Eric, welcome to the podcast. I'm super excited to work with you today. Thanks for being here, man.
Thank you. Thank you.
For people who might not be familiar with you and all the amazing stuff that you're doing on Instagram and in the sports performance and strength and conditioning world, would you mind filling them in a little bit about who you are and all the great stuff that you do day in and day out?
Thank you. So I came from Taiwan. I used to work with some national team athletes in Taiwan, like basketball, table tennis, badminton. I used to be a freelancer, so I train I also help rugby team, women's soccer back. It's like all over the place. And do some consultant like for track. I do some consultant for like coaches who want to understand force plate, force velocity curve. And now I'm based at at University of Louisville, men's basketball assistant strength coach, and at the same time helping the track and field jump team as assistant for Bob Thurnhofer.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So you are, I'm going to call you Mr. Worldwide, Eric. It seems like you've been everywhere and you've accomplished so many great things. And it seems like you're a very sought after individual from a consulting standpoint. And it seems like you really seem to know a lot in the world of strength and conditioning, especially as you mentioned, as it relates to speed and how the force velocity curve applies to, the more athletic side of things.
Thank you. So, I'm a huge speed fan because I used to be a Coach Boo fan, a Randy Huntington fan. So if people are familiar with track and field, the Chinese the fastest guy in Asia, who used to coach by Randy Huntington. I'm his fan and big Joseph Coyne fan. So, and I sprint myself, so I'm big sprinting guy. And that I think that kind of helped me understand more of the biomechanics, the step related to how the pelvic and the deceleration change of direction. And because at the end of the day, if you really sprint like baseball, basketball, it's kind of, I'm not gonna say it's slow-mo, but it's kind of like slow-mo to track coaches.
Yeah, no, definitely. There's certainly a difference in your top end speed that you can get in something like a straight line 100-meter compared to, what you can get in 40 or 50 feet on a basketball court. So
Yeah.
I completely echo that point, and I love your interest and background in speed. And while I think a lot of people love to chase the top end speed type of thing and type of value, at least from where I sit from a physical therapy standpoint, I end up seeing a lot more people because of deceleration type things, whether it's a hamstring injury or whether it's just some kind of knee injury. I've noticed things tend to occur when we're slowing down more than we're speeding up. Do you have any kind of thoughts on, what goes into deceleration and why we might be seeing people get injured more in the slowing down than the speeding up?
I think I'm gonna say it depends on the athlete,
Mhm.
but usually if it's track athlete, maybe it's because when we do acceleration, maybe the step was too vertical instead of you should push back. And if it's like a max velocity, we want we want our athlete to kind of step right under, although it's gonna be a little bit further, a little bit forward of our center of mass. The reason why we have hamstring injury for a linear speed is basically because their mechanics is wrong. When it comes to team sport athlete, it's kind of different because the speed for team sport athlete is not that fast. So sometimes I think a lot of times what strength and conditioning coaches like me, what we do is we maybe focus too much on the power output. We focus too much on concentric instead of eccentric. We focus too much on propulsive phase instead of like absorb the force. It end up like they don't have good mechanics on landing. They don't have good mechanics on braking or change of direction. So I think that's probably the main reason like a lot of like basketball players or a lot of like rugby. I work with rugby before, so a lot of like
Mhm.
rugby players they tear their hamstring or they pop their ACL. I think that's a big reason because at the end of the day, if you don't like step at the right position at the right time, it doesn't matter how strong you are. Not a lot of people in the world have is strong enough to handle that force. So you need to have like good mechanic.
Yeah, no, I love that point from a timing and a mechanics standpoint. I think to that, there's the biomechanical piece, as you mentioned, from the mechanics and the alignment and orientation of the joints as we're sprinting, as we're slowing down. But there's also that timing piece, what I'll call like a neurophysiological bucket of making sure that things kind of fire in the order that we want them to. And I think that there's certain things we can impact with training, right? Like we can improve someone's eccentric muscle strength and train their ability to slow themselves down with repetition. Well, from a mechanical standpoint, I like to make the argument that it's very difficult to change the way that someone runs. If someone's run, the same way for 25 years, I'm probably not going to magically change that in, an hour-long session once or twice a week. But, maybe if I give them a series of drills to work on and a series of skills to practice and with repetition, maybe we start to get a little bit of a change there. And I think that's another piece that a lot of strength coaches overlook is I've kind of changed my stance a bit. I think that mechanics are definitely an essential element because if you find yourself in the wrong position, you end up putting a lot more force and strain on structures that might not be prepared to take that. What do you tend to see from like the mechanics side from a sprinting standpoint? Kind of walk me through how you assess mechanics from like sprinting and deceleration and what you would consider like normal or optimal to be, if you don't mind, because I think a lot of people, and maybe myself included in that, have a misunderstanding of what things should look like from a sprint standpoint.
Let's start from acceleration. So usually if we train a sprinter, like high level sprinter, the block clearance should be like somewhere between like 36 to 45 degree. We want them to push out, but there's gonna be people are gonna say it's triple extend, but actually it's not. It's like full extension in the ankle, full extension in the hip, but the knee should stay slightly bent. You shouldn't see like triple extension, because if you see full triple extension, that means like you push too long. That's gonna dampen you're not gonna have enough time for your leg to recover. So the second step will be too vertical, especially when we're accelerating. You want them to push down and back. So if
Okay.
you push too vertical, you're just straight from acceleration to deceleration. So that think about that's like maybe 4 or 5 times body weight in a wrong position, your hamstring pop. No, we still need like a lot of like vertical force because you
Right.
need vertical force to like maintain the amount of vertical force you need is kind of the same with the amount of vertical horizontal force you need. So you push harder on horizontal force,
Mhm.
you're gonna need more vertical force. But what I'm saying is if you like didn't push it didn't stride your stride position isn't at the right position,
Mm.
it's gonna be less horizontal but more vertical.
Okay. So if your position isn't correct, you decrease the moment arm for the horizontal,
Yeah,
effectively increase the vertical
yeah,
to too high of a level.
yeah. And so that's acceleration. So when we come to max velocity, um, I want my athlete's stride like right under his hip. It's not gonna like just right under, it's gonna be a little like forward, little like in front of the center mass. because it still need like a little deceleration, then absorption, then push off. If you put like constantly, what happened at max velocity is like people try to kick out. So the point of ground contact was too far away from center of mass. So same, you can't handle that amount of force. Your hamstring can't handle that amount of force. And the other interesting part is like sometimes if you maybe see like people like coaches or athletes, they just start learning how to sprint, they're gonna tend to be more backside. So that means like what I want to do in max velocity, what in acceleration we try to like build up the momentum, right? And
Right.
at max velocity we try to maintain the momentum. We try like push vertical, stay at air longer, so it kind of like don't decrease our horizontal momentum. That's like what max velocity did. But sometimes like when we teach like younger athletes, they try to push over, so that means like they stay at the ground longer. So that means that they're gonna be more backside. They want to like over push. They don't have enough like strength to like handle the strain of the backside for the hamstring. So same thing, hamstring pop. Does that make
Right.
sense to you?
Yeah, I'm following what you're saying there. And essentially, the more backside heavy they are, the more load we get through the hamstring.
Yeah.
Yeah. And essentially, that's kind of a breakdown from accelerating, so building velocity to max velocity, where we shift to the maintenance of that speed that we've just
Yeah.
built. And at that point, we're not getting any faster. It's as fast as we can go. We just need to maintain that as long as we can. And
Yeah.
as you mentioned, that's very high force and very, very short ground contact
Yeah.
times. And I bring up this point, it's stating the obvious, but I think a lot of people forget, like when we are at that max velocity sprint, it is essentially a repeat of single leg bounds from one leg to the next leg over and over and over again at speeds that are next to impossible to train from like a jumping standpoint alone, right? Like the only way I see to get that kind of load through the leg is to literally sprint. Like I don't think there's a bound progression that comes to mind for me that hits that level of force at that speed over and over and over again.
Yeah. So if you really like, I think if you really want to like decrease the amount of like hamstring strain, no matter it's like team sport, track, you need a sprint. You need to put them out and do some max velocity work.
Right.
So I kind of like didn't answer the second part of the question about deceleration. Sorry, I forgot about it. But um, so when it comes to like deceleration, let's think about a basketball player. He's gonna do a step back jump shot. So he probably gonna dribble, like push, try to cut on the right side, and then step back, right? So what he did there is like you push. I'm gonna use triple extension here.
Yep.
Maybe, although sometimes some athlete did, some athlete didn't. And when at deceleration, what they did is kind of like triple flexion. So that means like your hip gonna internal rotate, your tibia gonna internal rotate, and your ankle is gonna evert, right? Evert, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
If you don't have like maybe enough hip internal rotation, if you don't have like enough uh tibia internal rotation, if you can't like do eversion on your ankle, you just don't have like the space, don't have the range of motion to absorb the force. And think about it, that's a lot of force you need to absorb. Although like nowadays at like strength and conditioning world, people want our athlete to be more stiff because they can jump higher, they can run faster. But at the same time, you want them to like have the range of motion to do that, have the ability to absorb the force.
Yeah, I think that's an essential point, the ability to absorb the force when we're slowing down. And that's an area that I think creates all the problems we mentioned earlier, right? If I can't effectively distribute the force throughout my entire system, then it's all going to go to something that I might not want it to. And then, this is a hypothetical question. I don't think anyone knows the answer. Then it becomes a question of, is it too much force in one instance that causes something to go, like a hamstring to tear or an ACL to tear, or is it just repetitively exposing it to higher forces that kind of creates almost like a micro trauma where we injure a percentage of it and another percentage of it, and eventually it's just too much and it can't hold on anymore. So I certainly think that there's an element, as you mentioned, to having the mechanical side checked from a deceleration standpoint, but also having the ability to effectively distribute that deceleration force through your entire system and not just having it go onto one structure. And I think that's a place where, from a coaching standpoint, you need to have conversations with your players, because you can start to pick up on these things by talking with your guys or your girls, right? Like if someone comes in and they're like, hey, I'm starting to get, some irritation and pain here, maybe that's your sign that, hey, we're missing something here. Maybe it's a strength thing. Maybe it's, a mechanic thing, and we're starting to overload that tissue too much. But I think this is an area where those conversations with players become very important to kind of help you as a coach determine what can be going on during that deceleration phase.
To answer the first part of your question, like I think this depends, but like I think most of the hamstring injury or most of the ACL injury is probably like, I'm not gonna say overuse, but just exposed too much time with wrong mechanics. Sometimes it happen with one instance, but I think most of the time it's just like too many repetition with wrong mechanics, and then at the end, your muscle or your system just can't handle it, and then popped. And if I'm dealing with my athlete, usually what I teach, if let's say if it's basketball or rugby, usually what I'll teach is like start from like linear deceleration. Just start from like let them like standing and then try to fall, and then like let them try to like land with one leg. Teach them like 4-foot landing. That's a start. And or you can just easily like teach them how to jump off of a box and 4-foot landing with the right mechanic, like knees and toes are in line, those kind of stuff, and start from there. So what I see is like if you teach the right mechanic, the soreness or like some like discomfort, usually I'm not gonna say go away immediately, but those kind of stuff just maybe stop bothering them. They just immediately, like probably after a few sessions, they just feel better.
When you say right mechanic, you're essentially referring to a position where, as we just mentioned, it distributes force or load through the tissue more effectively and efficiently than, say, something that's a little bit more improper,
Yeah.
we'll say.
Yeah. So in team sport athlete, you oftentimes gonna see is like they don't know how to do 4-foot landing.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's in my experience with basketball, with rugby, if you ask them to do a deceleration step, it would be like the front of the foot. I forgot the name. So it'd be the front of the foot landing, and
Yeah,
the
yeah,
heel will
4 foot.
still be raising the
Yep,
forefoot, right?
yep.
Yeah. So you need to like what I would do is over kind of like it's kind of like over cue, but like I'll say try to push back with your heel. At that point, they're gonna be like 4-foot landing. But some of the athlete, they're gonna be like the heel still gonna be raising, so they still land on their forefoot. So I'm gonna emphasize it more and tell them like try to bend less at your knee. Try to don't drop too much. So
Yeah.
that's how I would start. And like you mentioned, try to like distribute the force like to ankle, knee, hip.
It sounds like from a deceleration standpoint, as we mentioned earlier, we need to get someone moving really fast and then have them slow down from it. And then the other piece, as you're just kind of alluding to now, that we can hit on is we can hit on the ability to absorb force, since deceleration is force absorption and slowing down. And as you just mentioned, we could start with just teaching a simple 4-foot landing. We could also go about, as you mentioned, just kind of jumping off of a box. And I think that's a great simple progression. And, you can use this with your younger athletes. I use it in a rehab standing or setting where I literally go from like a 4-inch box and we just jump down from 2 inches. It's not that high. It's usually not that scary. And if you've got someone who just had, say, knee surgery like 4 months ago, this is a great starting point to build some confidence and build some repetition. And then over time, you can progress the box height because the higher we go, the more force there's going to be. But then you can switch it to a single leg and you can jump off and absorb force, practice the landing. And then over time, I like to even throw in the land and then jump up from that position. So we absorb force and then quickly push force into the ground and spring up out of it. And you could make that a vertical vector by cueing like a straight jump up, or a horizontal vector by cueing more of like a broad jump or a hop type variation. That's at least been my progression myself from a absorbing force standpoint. How do you kind of go about progressing that force absorption standpoint, or how would you go about taking like a simple like depth jump type thing and moving it, a step further, Eric?
This is what I take from Exos
Yep.
and one of my friend Andrew Paul. If it's let's say I got a new athlete, I want to teach them to decelerate. The first thing I would do is actually ask them to jump on a box because there's not a lot of force they need to absorb, right?
Right.
But you teach the right mechanic.
Yeah, because if you're jumping up to say that 4-inch box again, maybe you jump up 6 inches, your effective gravity is 2 inches to go down to the 4-inch
Yeah,
box. Yeah.
yeah. And then after they can safely jump on the box, the mechanics is right. All gonna do is like
Yeah, the
yeah,
snap down from 2 onto 1.
yeah. And then I'll jump off a box and
Gotcha.
then increase the jump height. That's if it's like vertical deceleration, and this is vertical. So if we're gonna go to horizontal deceleration, let's say I'm gonna ask my athlete to run. I'm gonna put on a cone from the start. The second cone would be like maybe like 10 meters, and the third cone would be like 20 meters. So
Hmm.
like 10 meters in between the cones, right? I ask them to run as fast as they can to the second cone and try to stop at the third cone. So
Right.
that's like you can like modify the distance if you want. You can go from like acceleration 10 meters and maybe deceleration 20 meters, maybe deceleration 15 meters, and then 10 meters and then 5 meters. You can go by that. And
Right.
then yeah, that's like linear speed. And then if you want to like change the direction, you can do a shuffle, a push, and a hold. Like
Yep.
push and stop, push and stop. It's the same with it's the same with crossover step or someone or like someone gonna say lateral run. It's the same. Push and try to land. Stiff landing. Push, stiff landing.
I like the way you approach the vertical versus the horizontal. I definitely agree with starting with the jump up. I think the snap down gets a lot of hate. I do think it has a time and a place. And I certainly think that if you've got someone who's very new to this world or someone in the post-op rehab setting, the snap down holds value. I don't think it's your end all be all. You can't just stay at the snap down, but there is a time and a place for it. And there's even variations of that you can add in to hit some of those other components as well, right? I can give an athlete a med ball and have them twist as they come down and add in a little bit more of a rotational control there. I love the concept of the horizontal vector as well. And I think that the way you broke down the speed up or acceleration distance to the deceleration distance is very, very important because, as you mentioned, you can change those variations of how much runway you give them to speed up and how much room you give them to slow down so much. And if you're someone who's got access to some of the cool tech in today's day and age, you should be able to know when the athlete you're working with, when they're going to hit their max velocity. So if you want to train, you could kind of like work backwards from that and say, hey, I know 40 yards in, they're going to be at max velocity. So let's start with 20-yard buildup and, X amount of room to slow down. And then we'll work up to max velocity from there.
But like the problem with team sport athlete is like they don't call, most of the team sport athlete they don't really hit max velocity. So
Right.
the reason for training team sport athlete max velocity is to keep them in injury free because there's nothing like max velocity. Like you kind of talked a little bit before. There's nothing like max velocity. This it's probably the highest plyometric you can get. So that's probably the main reason we train team sport athlete max velocity. Like basketball, like rugby, like football, they tend to not like get max velocity during the game. If they get max velocity during the game, that means like, oh, if you're like winning a lot or you're gonna chase a guy a lot.
Yeah.
That's usually not a good thing. But like you mentioned, like that, like the 10 meters lead in and then 10 meters like decel, that's like if you got a new athlete, that's how you're gonna progress it.
Yeah, and that's a 1-to-1 ratio, right?
Yeah.
So you can calculate the ratio as well
Yeah.
of XL distance to decel distance.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is there certain like cuts that you have for that you consider like higher intensity versus lower intensity? Like, say like 30-yard buildup for max velocity or high velocity to like 5-yard deceleration. Like, where do you kind of draw the lines on your cone distances and intensities that way?
I didn't really go that much like long for like build up. What I used to do is like just expose them to basic like deceleration step, like just like let their body lean a little bit forward and try to let their body catch it or try to push 2 or 3 steps and try to like decel and then push back. That's what I used to teach my athlete, like just expose them a little for like linear or from a linear standpoint. But if we're talking about like horizontal standpoint, I'm gonna use like resisted bands to do resisted push for a few step and then assisted pushback. So at the end, they need to able to catch or absorb the force with the assisted band, like try like pushing them back. That means like they need to absorb more force. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, yeah, I'm
Yeah.
following what you're saying.
Yeah. So it's kind of the same with if you want to progress it with linear standpoint. I can simply use it with Kaiser machine, like Kaiser use a Kaiser with belt and let them do like that's the same kind of drop their center mass, try to and tell your athlete to catch it and push back. In gameplays, it's a lot of force. You can't really mimic that during training. And there's a lot of chaotic situation. And most of the time, I think the reason why athletes get injured is that it's a chaotic situation. They're not familiar with that situation, and they at the same time they need to uh biomechanically do the right thing.
Right, right. Have some sense of when I'm in this position, this is what I do. And I certainly think that's where training comes in. You brought up a great point too about just the amount of force and just overall contacts that can occur during a season. You mentioned you've worked with football and rugby and basketball, and basketball's kind of in season now, and it can be a lot for guys to travel and the amount of games and all that way. I'd imagine that, if you're in season, you probably reduce your contacts from a training standpoint just to avoid overworking some of these guys. Is that kind of how you go about modifying, is like decrease intensity on certain days or decrease load on certain days and kind of adjust based on how the guys are, how many minutes they're putting in and that sort of thing?
So nowadays, you got a lot of technology like Catapult, Connect Song. We use Catapult. You can easily like monitor the play they get, the player load that gets from each practice or the practice duration. so I can monitor from that. And because I came from an SFMA background, you can do table stretch to easily like see their range of motion. Like there's gonna be a bandwidth from day to day. But if you found out like, I think he's tired today, and you can simply ask how they feel today. They're like, nah, not feeling good today. Yeah, I'm gonna like reduce intensity, reduce the volume, whatever it is. Maybe discuss with the athlete. But if it's in season, my approach would probably be different with a lot of coaches. What I prefer to do, but this is me, I prefer to do is like try to help them have the amount of like range of motion they can control, and still like try to teach them, try to let them have maybe expose them to the right biomechanic, have the good range of motion. I think that's enough for like deceleration.
I'll take a step further. Just understand the stimulus that you want to train and how you can train it, right? So if I want to teach eccentric force control, sure, I could load up a trap bar deadlift with 315, but most guys are probably not going to want to do that right after a game. But if I have someone do a single leg jump off of a 12-inch box, that's probably still a fairly high amount of force in newtons that they're putting through that leg. But a 12-inch, depth drop does not really scare people the same way a 315-pound deadlift might.
Like you mentioned, like maybe during the hectic season, like basketball, there's probably 2 games per week in college setting. And if it's like, I don't know, if it's NBA, there's probably more.
Mm-hmm.
You don't, and the guys probably don't want to lift that heavy. And when we talk about like deceleration, your body try to like absorb the force. So if you do, people are gonna, I know coach is gonna talk about like tempo eccentric, or like control the way down. But if you do that, that actually decrease the eccentric force production you produce.
Really?
Yeah.
So,
So,
like controlling the eccentric with a certain tempo decreases
yeah.
the eccentric moment.
Yeah, that actually decrease your ability to eccentrically produce force.
So instead of doing like a slow controlled tempo, we should look more for like a rapid eccentric then.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So that's why, like you mentioned, drop off from the box is
Mm-hmm.
good. But think about it, if it's in season, and I mean, if it's like 12-inch, that's good enough. But if it's higher, the amount of force they're gonna absorb is higher.
Right.
So still, I'm just gonna teach them the basic mechanics, let them have good range of motion. I think that's enough. And maybe expose them to like some sort of like single leg, plyometric, bounding. Think about it. In bounding, each step is decelerate, absorb, deceleration, absorption, like right, and then propulsive phase, right?
Right.
Yeah. So that stuff work, or you can easily like implement a little like you can bound 2-step and decelerate, right?
Right.
That's a deceleration. You can microdose it into your warm up, and it's the same with change of direction.
Right.
So that's if it's in season, that's basically how I would implement it. And I used to do it, and I think it's a pretty good model for coaches to implement it. It's simply just on the court, the velocity is so like faster than the velocity is just faster. So the amount of force your body gonna absorb is way higher than what you can do in the weight room.
Right.
And
Right.
yeah,
We don't have perfect carryover from the weight room
yeah,
to the court, regardless of how much we try.
yeah. Didn't matter how heavy you squat, you just can't do it. And like I mentioned, slow, heavy, eccentric actually kind of dampen your eccentric force production capability. So the only thing I'm gonna do in season is just microdose this into my warm up and teach them the right mechanic. That's all. But if it's off season, I'm gonna do a lot. I'm gonna do linear deceleration. I'm gonna do lateral deceleration. I'm gonna do vertical deceleration with like maybe 3 sets of 6, 3 sets of 4, whatever it is. Off season is different. I'm gonna build up their capacity to do that.
Right. In the off season, do you program linear, lateral, angular? Are you programming all of those in the same sessions, or are they each getting their own session? And how many, ground contacts are you looking for from a dosing standpoint for each? Are you saying, hey, look, 30 to 40 is enough, or are you kind of pushing the limit and saying, hey, look, we got to get these guys into the hundreds here?
In a perfect world, I would do linear deceleration on Monday and Thursday. I would do lateral deceleration on Tuesday and Friday in a perfect world. So if it's off season and the players are fresh, I'm gonna it's kind of the same what I would do in season. So microdose it into warm up. Maybe the intensity is higher, maybe the volume's higher. I'm not gonna really count the I'm not gonna really count the ground contact time. If the linear deceleration, the volume, the intensity too high, I'm just gonna probably cut half the weight room session. Or
Right.
maybe I'm just gonna cut the next day. I'm maybe gonna decrease a little like horizontal, like sorry, lateral movement, lateral deceleration. Yeah, but I'm definitely gonna try to build up their capacity. Maybe three, even go to like 3 sets of 10 each session.
That's the kind of thing. I know someone listening is going to listen to that and they're going to say, like, you mean to say only 3 sets of 10? But I think the people that say that or think that probably misunderstand. Like, these should be intense, these should be extremely high force. And, we're not trying to turn plyometric activity into conditioning here. We're trying to
Yeah,
keep plyometric. Sure,
yeah,
we could smoke someone and do like, 5 sets of 20, but I guarantee you they're going to feel awful walking out. And
yeah,
we're starting to get to the detrimental point of the training. Our goal is to stimulate something that our body can adapt to, not cause detriment. And we want to focus on quality of movement and we want to focus on high force production. Well, if I fatigue someone, they're gonna they're gonna put less force into the ground.
yeah,
So
that's
if they're
true.
tired and we're not getting force output, what's the benefit of it?
I think this is probably the most important thing I'm gonna say for like a lot of coaches kind of make this mistake is like they didn't really see how the athlete move. They just designed their training program and just strictly followed that. I'm gonna say, man, you're gonna look at how they move. There's like so many times, it's countless time. I have a training program design on my hand, and when I see how my athlete move, man, I'm gonna cut it. So even sometimes 3 sets of 10 and with good mechanics, you can easily see they're tired at maybe the end of second set. It's no need for you to like do like another set with bad mechanic.
Right. No, exactly. And I think that's what separates a good coach from a great coach, right? You might have a great plan for the session and you might walk in and your athlete is just moving like,
Yeah,
and when that happens, you got to throw that plan out and start over on the fly.
yeah,
And if you don't do that and adapt to how your athlete is presenting, then you're possibly opening them up for a whole world of detrimental effects.
yeah. You're gonna get a low back injury, you're gonna get whatever injury it is.
No, for sure. And I think that's where, your ability to adjust on the fly can certainly separate a good coach from a great coach. On the concept of deceleration as well, we've talked about linear, we've talked about lateral, we've talked about different vectors. One of the ones that I've found most interesting, and I see this mostly with a sport like baseball or softball, is that curvilinear moment, where you see it a little bit in football based on the route they're running, but kind of like an angular run kind of thing. You know what I mean? That's an area where I feel like the forces in the moment arms change, and we certainly put a lot more load through the hamstring when we're running at an angle as opposed to, straight line running, I'll say.
So yeah, that's a part like I'm gonna say the word again. The mechanics matter the most.
Yes.
So one thing you're gonna need to expose your athlete to like curvilinear running during the off season. So when they really get that during the season, it's not new to them. It's not chaotic. So they're not gonna get injured. And the second thing, it's kind of the same with when we talk about like linear sprinting. You don't want to over push on each step. If you over push on each step, that means like your foot gonna stay longer on a step. Instead of a push, it's gonna be like a little bit like pull. And that's the dangerous part. What I would look at in curvilinear running is I'd probably ask my athlete to like if I'm running this way, I'm probably gonna ask my athlete to like my shoulder gonna be like this way instead of like pushing down. So they over rotate. So when they push back this way, their foot actually can step on the right position without over pushing.
Right. So not over pushing, but also, as you just mentioned, paying attention to the things above the chain as well. Where's the trunk? Where are the shoulders? Because naturally that trunk angle can really, just like we talk about the foot and ankle playing a role with things that like the knee or the hip, we have to look above as well because the trunk angle can certainly impact how the hip moves as well.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
And that's an area that I feel like is often missed as well. But it's one of my favorite things to train with people. One of my favorite things to do is set up a landmine, have them zercher it, and then lean into the landmine. Now we've got that angular component, and I can stand on the outside leg, or I can hold that angled zercher position. I'm not loading that too heavy, maybe a 10-pound bumper plate, just something to hold against. And we can literally bound from one leg to the next to the other there, right? So now we've got that angular trunk lean that we're going to see with the curvilinear run, and now we're going to get a little single leg force absorption in that position as well.
Yeah, that's a good one.
And I think that's an area that's often missed, but needs to be addressed from both a strength and conditioning and rehab standpoint. Is there any other drills that you like to hit that curvilinear component that way from a training?
If you're a football fan, during the off season they do like they put like mini cones with eight shape of eight
Yep.
and like let them run through that,
Yep.
let them chase each other. Or like I would easily put on like a circle and
Mm-hmm.
do the same thing, let them chase each other. So if athlete A run this way, athlete B gonna run this way. And
Yep.
they're gonna chase each other. And if it change direction, if athlete B run this way, athlete A gonna run this way. They're gonna chase each other.
Yeah.
That's a little, and that's change of direction, and that's also a little like curvilinear. So
And
I
you're
think,
adding a reactive element too, which makes
yeah,
it a
yeah.
million times better in my mind.
You don't need to like teach. You don't really need to teach a lot, but they're exposed to that, so that's good for them. I mean, people sometimes, coaches sometimes like overthink too much. Just put them in a certain situation, and they're exposed to a lot of like good elements, and don't overdo that.
To the point you mentioned before, the highest intensity is in the game. Well, why not make your training act like a game? That
Yeah,
way it's at a higher intensity, right?
yeah, and there's like it's sort of like chaotic, not really chaotic, but you need to think, you need to process information at the same time. So I mean, it's probably if I'm gonna say the drill I use, I think that probably the best for like change of direction or like you mentioned curvilinear deceleration. That's probably the one I would recommend.
No, definitely, definitely. And I think, again, that type of thing, it can be done pretty much anywhere with minimal to no equipment. And it can be applied from a strength and conditioning standpoint up to a rehab standpoint, right? Like
Yeah,
I've got someone 9, 10 months post-op ACL, for example, and they've been cleared by their surgeon. Before they go back into sport, I want to make sure that they're comfortable and confident doing these things. Because if they're not comfortable and confident doing it in training or in PT or in isolation, they're probably not going to feel too good doing it in a game.
yeah, and like can just start really slow.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Start slow and build, or, we didn't touch on rest periods today, but, give them more of a rest in between bouts.
Yeah.
let them recover, let them take a minute. You don't have to you don't have to turn everything into a conditioning exercise. You don't have to go 10-second break and then go again. I know everyone is on a time crunch, and the amount of time we get with the athletes is seemingly never enough. But, you have to focus on the quality at the end of the day. And if waiting 30 seconds longer gets me a better quality rep, I'll make that trade every day.
Yeah. So this is like you're asking me about how will I program it during the off season, the sets and reps. These kind of drills is actually what I will implement at probably the first few weeks of training camp starts.
Yep.
And because the intensity is like high, so I'm gonna go like maybe like 20 seconds and let them rest like 2 or 3 minutes.
Yep.
And if I want them to do like maybe 5 to 10 sets, I'm just gonna cut the weight room. That's how I'll do it.
Definitely. Adjust on the fly, as we said. Eric, I feel like we covered a lot of great consideration points as it relates to deceleration across different different like force vectors, from linear to angular, curvilinear, lateral. I feel like we touched on a lot of different things. We touched on some great programming considerations, and to the point you mentioned before, it comes back to understanding the mechanics and underlying principles, the things that the adaptations we're trying to acquire, and ultimately, the ability to accelerate before we decelerate. I feel like we covered a lot of ground today. Do you have any kind of thoughts or remarks or anything that we missed as we were talking today?
I think that's good. But so I think the most important thing now is like nowadays coaches tend to like over bias to like numbers, like sport technology, all those stuff. I think if you focus on the people in front of you instead of like what the force plate data shows, man, that's gonna be like more important. There's gonna be times like, oh, this is actually what I'm sorry, but this is actually what I discussed with some coaches at Exos and so some coaches at Pro Setting. We're discussing about this. So if you only look at the number like peak braking force, eccentric braking force, eccentric RFD, yeah, it's gonna increase their ability to decelerate. It's gonna increase their performance. But think about it, if you increase stiffness at the short time, they're gonna increase performance. But at the long run, you're kind of like try to exchange, you're trying to use their like health to exchange for the short term performance. Because at the long run, you need to have like good enough range of motion to absorb that. If you don't have enough range of motion, your body can easily find another part to compensate. So you got low back pain, you got groin pain.
Right. And eventually you won't be able to just bend, you'll break.
Yeah.
I love those points. As you mentioned, first off, treat people like people. I think it's crazy that we have to say this so much, but athletes are people. They might have, family, they might have a dog at home, they might have a kid, right? Like these things matter to them, and there's more to life for them than just training. So making sure you take that into account. I love your point on, there's more to it than just the force plate data. I think the subjective piece is the most underutilized piece of what we can do on the day to day. And I think that's arguably the most important. I think you can probably get 80 to 90% of what you need from that alone. A lot of athletes, they've been training for a long time. They know their body well. If something doesn't feel right, they can pretty much give you a good idea very quickly. So I love those points, and I love just kind of the direction this conversation took, Eric. I think you're an amazing individual doing amazing things like we talked about before, and I'm sure somebody listening is going to want to find out more about you. Where can they find you at? Are you on Instagram and that sort of thing?
So I'm on Instagram. You can simply type Eric Hsu or Eric the Performance Guy. So ERIC the Performance Guy or ERICHSU. It pops up, and If you want to learn more about these, you can Google, you can YouTube like Eric, the performance guy, that'll pop up.
Yeah, because you have your own channel and podcast as well, correct?
Yeah.
Awesome. So we will link to that in the description below as well. So if you didn't quite catch those, you can check those out and learn along with Eric and see all the amazing things that he's doing day after day. Eric, this was awesome. I really appreciate your time today, man.
Thank you.